Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Paving the Way, Taking Bold Action Towards Environmental Justice. My name is Shobita Parthasarathi. I'm professor of public policy and director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program known as STPP at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. STPP is an interdisciplinary, university-wide program dedicated to training students, conducting cutting-edge research, and informing the public and policymakers on issues at the intersection of technology, science, equity, society, and public policy. For students interested in our graduate certificate program, there'll be a virtual information session on Monday, February 10th at 4 p.m. The next deadline to apply for the certificate is March 1st. If you'd like to hear more about it or sign up for our information session, you can visit our website, which is stpp.fordschool.umich.edu. Our partners at the School for Environment and Sustainability also have graduate programs and sustainability boot camps that are currently accepting applications. Learn more at seas.umich.edu. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on one of U of M and environmental justice's great leaders, the late Professor Emeritus Bunyan Bryant. Professor Bryant truly embodied the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrated last week, and in today's panel. He was a pioneer in the environmental justice field and helped to establish the nation's first environmental justice program here at University of Michigan SEAS. He taught here for 4 decades and passed away just recently in March of 2024. Earlier this afternoon, SEAS dedicated the Bunyan Bryant Memorial Classroom in the Dana Building in honor of Professor Bryant's lifelong environmental and racial justice advocacy. Professor Bryant's wife, Jean Carlberg, was at the ceremony, and she's with us tonight at this event. Jean, on behalf of SEAS and U of M, we are grateful for your husband's and yours tireless passion for creating change and a better world. Thank you. Before we get to our main program, in the spirit of justice, we must acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. The Ann Arbor campus currently resides on land ceded through the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Additionally, in 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan, ceded through the Treaty of Fort Meigs, with the hope that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the sovereignty of tribal lands and the painful history of genocide, forced assimilation, and displacement of Native communities that facilitated the establishment of this university. We affirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land, the profound contributions of Native Americans to this institution, and the university's commitment to educate the children of Native ancestors. Now to tonight's panel. The trailblazers on this stage are challenging the status quo, breaking down barriers, and carving out their own paths towards a more just and sustainable future. Their journeys reflect the spirit of Dr. King's vision for divine discontent, never settling, and always striving for a better world. As we get into the program, I'd like to thank our event partners at the School for Environment and Sustainability for planning and bringing together leaders and best in their field. This panel spotlights the leaders who are transforming the fields of environmental justice, energy, and sustainability. We'll start with a few opening remarks from them, have some panel discussion, and turn to ask pre-selected members of the audience to ask their questions, which were submitted in advance. It's my pleasure to welcome Shalanda Baker, U of M's first Vice Provost for Sustainability and Climate Action, who served as the Director of the Office of Energy Justice and Equity at the U.S. Department of Energy, who is leading the movement for climate justice and pushing for inclusivity in policy and practice. Tony Reames. Tony Reames, Associate Professor at SEAS, who served as Deputy Director for Energy Justice and Principal Deputy Director for the Office of State and Community Energy Programs, also in the U.S. Department of Energy, who is a driving force behind energy justice initiatives to ensure all communities have access to clean energy. Carla Walker-Miller, CEO of Walker-Miller Energy Services, who is reshaping the energy landscape with a focus on equity and sustainable solutions. Jalonne White-Newsome, the first federal Chief Environmental Justice Officer at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, who has helped to deliver President Biden's ambitious environmental justice agenda while elevating environmental justice work across the federal government and beyond. And our moderator for this evening is Maddie Miller, a PhD candidate at SEAS, who is also the founder and CEO of NexTiles, a Detroit-based textile recycling company that converts textile waste into building insulation and other eco-friendly products. I am so looking forward to hearing from this extraordinary group of people, so I will now turn it over to Maddie.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us in this exciting panel, in this very timely session. I want to extend my gratitude to our panelists again. It means so much that you guys are here this evening, and we'll get started. So I'd first like to invite each of you to take a moment to reflect, given the time that we're in, talk a little bit about what you all see as the biggest opportunities for advancing justice in this moment. And we'll start with Dr. White-Newsome.
Good evening. Oh, I need some more energy than that. Good evening. I want you to take a minute and look at the person next to you to your right and just say, I see you, and I'm glad you're here, because we are still here. All right. So first of all, thank you, Maddie. I am just honored and privileged to be among these trailblazers. Mrs. Bryant, so wonderful to see you, and thank you for you and your husband's work and legacy. And again, it is nothing that I take for granted to be back in Rackham. I remember rushing upstairs to turn in my dissertation, so if you see me do this a little bit, you know why. But what I will say is that we are in a moment, and when I think about this moment that we are in, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm 7 days from being off of government payroll, so I'm still processing. But I think we have an opportunity to do a couple of things. One, we need to act. And I say all the time, environmental justice didn't start with the federal government, and it won't end with the federal government. So it is up to everyone to make sure that you are using your power and privilege for good. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we have to adapt. What's cool about the previous administration is that we put together some great resources and tools and models of what environmental justice could really look like. We had community advisors and experts that really guided the work of the administration. Just because it's been a shift in the administration doesn't mean it needs to be a shift in the work. So we have to make sure that we adapt those previous federal tools to the work that we're doing on the ground. The third thing that I'll say is we have to acknowledge that, again, we are in this special moment. But I believe firmly that there is, I'm going to just go ahead and say this, the word triumph. Trump is in that word, but we're still going to triumph. And so when I think about acknowledging the moment that we're in, I'm also acknowledging our ancestors. We don't have the right to sit back and be fearful and not do anything. So if anything, I encourage everybody, again, we have to acknowledge the madness that's happened, but remember our ancestors fought and died for us to be on this stage and to be in this position that we're at. So again, I encourage you to think about that acknowledgement, adapting, and again, taking action. Thanks.
Thank you for those powerful words, Dr. White-Newsome. Carla?
Yes, I'll start by saying, let the church say amen. And we are basically on the same page. I think that all the work that's been done, all the important work that was done in the last few years, and I actually should thank my colleagues for their service, because they all served in the administration, in federal service. And one of the reasons we have such an opportunity right now is they were able to push programs, push initiatives, push dollars into the ecosystem that are going to continue to drive equity. Right now, just so you all know, I am a business owner. I'm a founder of a business, and we've spent the last 15 years in clean energy, but not just in clean energy, but inviting those who have no organic connections to the clean energy industry into the industry, so that the industry can reflect the demographics of the people of this country, so that we can all benefit from the clean energy transition. It's not going to go away, but thanks to the work that's been done in the last 3 years, there is more money, there are more dollars devoted to more communities than we have ever seen in this country. We have the opportunity to continue to invite people not just to experience new jobs in the energy industry, so we can invite them into jobs, but we can invite them into expanding existing businesses, starting new businesses, thought leadership, policy development, all the places we've been missing for decades. Those are the places and the spaces that all people have a right to be in, all people are paying for with federal dollars, with tax dollars, with their investments, and as Dr. White-Newsome said, with the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors. How dare we not walk into the opportunity that this moment has prepared? This is a movement, and this is a season, you all. This is a season, but everything that those in service have done in the last few years have been for such a time as this. And even though my heart despairs, even though I am hurting, we gotta walk, we have to run, we have to operate in whatever spaces we are in and do the work that's set before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you so much for that. I want to echo the appreciation that we should have for our fearless environmental justice leaders. Tony?
Wow. how do I follow these amazing women here? I understand my role on the panel today, but it is amazing to be here. I just want to take a moment to say that, this is a family up here, right? Although some of us have longer relationships with each other, shorter relationships, but we've been in this work, and I think that's one thing I want to point out, that if you're in this work, if you're trying to get into this work, it's really about family. It's that connection to the people, that locking arms to really create that fortitude that you need in times like this. Since we're celebrating Martin Luther King and kind of keeping the church theme, so you all can say amen, one of the quotes that always sticks out to me is that quote about the arc of the moral universe. And while it's long, it bends toward justice. And I've taken time to kind of dig into that quote a little bit to understand where it comes from. And it's really a paraphrasing of a 1853 sermon by Theodore Parker, an abolitionist minister. And in that sermon, he talks about, understanding that morality is a long fight, a long push. And though he can't see that it will eventually bend toward justice, he believes that it does. And only by his own conscience will it bend toward justice. And we know that President Obama used to use that quote a lot. But if you look at how he evolved that quote, he would often say, the arc of the moral universe is long, and it may bend toward justice, but it does not bend on its own. And I think that really gets at what Minister Parker was trying to say, is that we have to do the work. If we think about the environmental justice movement, starting, like Jalonne said, not in the federal government, but with people on the ground saying, my community is being poisoned. And actually fighting and laying their bodies on the line. If you think about Warren County in the 80s, you'll see the pictures of people laying in front of big trucks coming to build a landfill. And so it takes that type of work, although many of us may never lay our bodies on the line, but the little things that we can do to say, this is not right. Who's your circle of influence? Being able to share with them. And so in this moment, as Carla said, we may be sick to our stomach with what we're seeing. We may be in despair, like right now, like I have a frog in my throat because thinking about, our colleagues that are still in the federal government being laid off, not because they've done anything wrong, no performance issues, but because of the work they're doing for the American people. And so in this moment, we all must think about the small things, the large things that we can do, but more importantly, let's lock arms and do it together.
Amen.
Thank you, Tony. Building community is so important during this time. Shalanda, will you provide your insights on advancing justice in this climate?
Yes. Wow. So what a panel. I mean, these are people I respect and admire so deeply. I mean, Tony, you and I were working together. We were hanging onto that arc. We were hanging on for, 3 years, really fighting for a more just and equitable energy system, fighting to make sure our clean energy system doesn't continue to perpetuate harm and injustices around this country. So I have a lot of thoughts about how we are going to move forward, but I also want to kind of reach back in history a little bit. This past week reminded me of Reconstruction and how after emancipation, there were such strides for formerly enslaved people. We had representation in government. We had the traditional slaveholding states sending people to represent them who were formerly enslaved and who had the lineage of African descendants. And then we had places like Rosewood burned to the ground. We had the Tulsa race riots. We had lynching that went unchecked throughout the South, reigns of terror across the South. We also, it's deep. It's deep because when I think about what happened this past week, it was as if a match were set against all of the progress that was made. But when I think about that comparison and that analogy, I also think about what drove all of that. So coming out of slavery, it was about the fear, right? The fear that formerly enslaved people might actually get something, might actually gain something. And we who were in the federal government over the last 4 years were working so hard to create spaces for companies like Carla Walker-Miller's, companies like those that are not even contemplated, led by Black people, brown people, indigenous people, people who come from communities that have been polluted by the energy system. And the fear of that progress was so palpable on day one. And it took 3 days for that match to get struck and then burn it down. But the question was about, what do we do now? And so when I reach back in history, I know that we never lay down and that we're always here. And I'm also reminded of a queer Greek man who talked about oppression in the 70s, and he said, "How many ways did you try to bury me? But you forgot that I was a seed." And so that is the moment we find ourselves in, where we are repeating patterns of history, where strides get burned down, things get torn down because of fear, that certain parts of our population, whether they be immigrants, LGBT people who are trying to express their full selves, whether they be people who lacked education because of the systematic disenfranchisement of their communities and the lack of investment in their schools, the fear of those individuals, which are the majority, I mean, we're the majority, those individuals kind of having the type of power that fights against the structure, I mean, that is what we are still in, but every time we come back and we make these strides. So I think for me, the hope is that we will continue to have our seeds planted. But we cannot be individuals in this. We have to be together. We have to realize that we've got to talk, we've got to mourn, we've got to grieve, we've got to process all the stuff that just happened. But know that we are planted for the next generation. We are planted for those who are going to be here in 2100, who are going to reap everything that we are planting right now. So we cannot give up.
Thank you, Shalanda. Thank you, Shalanda, and thank you to all of the panelists for setting the stage for us to have this amazing conversation and to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. So we're gonna move on to the next question, which is for all of you. And I hope that it will allow our students and our audience members to get to know you all a lot better. When you think about your professional career and your commitment to advancing justice, talk about what fuels your passions for this space. Talk about that moment when you knew that this is what you wanted to do and when these fires sort of ignited in you all. And we'll start with Dr. White-Newsome again.
I thought you were going to break up the monotony. Okay.
Sorry.
I'm going to follow directions. My goodness, so many moments of inspiration, so many people of inspiration. But I'm just going to start back at the beginning. I am a native Detroiter, and I come from a family of folks that care about community. So I was just raised in making sure that folks that didn't have a voice, that were invisible, that didn't have access to resources, like it was our responsibility to change that, to flip that script. So my home church is New Bethel Baptist Church, the church of the late, great, not only Aretha Franklin, but her father, C.L. Franklin. And so when you talk about civil rights and growing up around folks that just took care and knew how to take care of business, that was my moment, my fire. And I said, okay, well, I'm not really here in this world just for me, but it's for the betterment of my community and other people. But as it relates to environmental justice, I had an opportunity in high school, and I'll shorten this story, to work for a large chemical company, because I was, again, aspiring to be a chemical engineer. And I started asking questions. my questions were, why were we seeing these negative pollution incidents in these communities around the plant, but also when we carried our chemicals across the country? So I started to track how many incidents were actually happening in different communities across this country, and you know the communities pretty much look the same. I kept that same line of inquiry going to school in Chicago and had an opportunity to connect with the mother of the environmental justice movement, Hazel Johnson, and she told me the same type of stuff was happening on the south side of Chicago. So this curious, inquiry, as well as knowing that everybody deserved to live in a healthy, safe environment, regardless of what you look like, started in high school for me. And I've just kind of kept that in every place that I've been. But I would say the most important thing, I think, that has been that inspiration has really been the people. So when I think about the late, great Reverend Dr. Joanne Watson, who told me, you keep on doing your work. When I think about Cecil Corbin Mark of We Act for Environmental Justice, who brought me into the EJ space and told me, we lead and do stuff with love. When I think about Mama Lila Cabell, great water warrior in Detroit, and she told me, you acknowledge the places and the spaces where you're at. So there have been so many moments of inspiration, so many people that have inspired me, and I know, again, that I stand on the shoulders of so many folks that sacrifice so much. So, again, my main inspiration now, even outside of the government, is that there are still communities, unfortunately, suffering. Still, that reality of environmental justice is still there, regardless of whatever the colorblind equality mess that's out there. So that's what continues to inspire me. So we have work to do. So, thank you.
Thank you for that. I share in that experience of finding out about communities of color being disproportionately affected by environmental injustices and wanting to do something about it. So thank you for that. Carla?
Yeah, I don't know why you all set me next to Dr. White-Newsome, but there is no good seat on this particular panel. I come to environmental justice by way of civil engineering. I received a civil engineering degree from Tennessee State University, an HBCU, which is where I'm from originally. And the experience that really brought me here is I worked for 18 years in corporate America and did my very best, believe what my parents said, which was, if you go in, you just need to be excellent. You've done the work, now just go be twice as good. One of the things that my parents did not prepare me for, though, is that does not gain any recognition necessarily, that I am going to be viewed through the lens of the people that I work with and not be judged on merit. So I literally spent 18 years in a job during which I was promoted when it was necessary because it looked ridiculous that I wasn't, and never being the ideal candidate for any position. 18 years. And don't get me wrong, met some great people, learned a lot. But when I left in 2000 to start my own company, it was with a commitment that I would have a company. I literally prayed, and I said, God, if you will help me to be successful, I will create a company that values people, period. I'll create a company where a hypersensitive, highly anxious introvert who's good at what she does and has goodwill toward people can be successful. And that is what God has allowed me to do, and I am forever grateful. After the recession in 2008, then I pivoted to the clean energy field just because the enabling legislation had been had passed in Michigan through Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. And once again, as we started to learn about energy efficiency, we were told that we were not wanted. We went to conferences and majority companies literally laughed at a Black company trying to do the work in the clean energy space. And that was when I decided that not only was I going to create a company that was going to be successful, the epitome of excellence, but that I was going to invite as many other Black people, brown people, indigenous people, excluded people into this industry, not for me, but for the good of the industry. Everything we do is with the mission to catalyze equity and catalyze excellence, and to show people that they are not mutually exclusive, that I have just as much right, you have, that everybody belongs in this clean energy space, that we cannot do the work of fighting climate change, of creating environmental justice, of decarbonization, of building resilience, unless everyone is a part of it. We need everyone. And there is no place for discrimination in this fight.
Thank you, Carla. You've done exactly what you've set out to do, and you've prioritized people all the while. It's quite impressive. Tony, what inspires you?
Yeah, this is such an amazing question, and Carla's being very humble. She has been an example for Black and brown communities and companies across this country and probably the world, hosting one of the first Black and brown energy conferences 2 years in a row, that's bringing together companies in a space that they didn't have before, so they don't have to go into a room and be laughed at. So I applaud her for her work. So I think this question about when does a light bulb come on for you to understand that the world is not fair is an interesting one. And if any of my energy justice students are in there, we talked about fairness in class today in the context that we're all living in. Like Carla, I'm a child of the South. I grew up in rural Lee County, South Carolina, the largest cotton producing county in the state, home to the Cotton Museum. We used to have a cotton, the Cotton Museum. We used to have a cotton picking festival. So that lets you know a little bit about the history of this place. The largest plantation in the county was home to Cotton Ed Smith, or Ed Cotton Smith, who was a major segregationist, and said, "Keep the cost of the Negro low and the cost of my cotton high." That is one of his most famous quotes. And so growing up, I didn't know, all the history about cotton because it's not really taught that way. And we're still in that space where people aren't teaching the true history of this country, and so people can operate in this society and not really understand why we're making the statements and comments that we are, why we are back in this place where in 3 days everything can be torn down. And so kind of following on that thread of being the largest cotton producing county, it was home to major textile industries. Everyone in my family worked in textile. And those jobs left in the 90s. They moved south, they moved over to Asia. A whole county devastated, its tax base ripped out over just a couple years. And so most everybody was struggling. Nobody knew what to do, high dependence on social welfare. And so the county leaders had to decide to bring something to the county to replace those jobs. Not new industry. They brought in the state's largest landfill and the state's largest maximum security prison. And I often tell people about those things coming to our community and how we were indoctrinated as kids to accept them. The landfill company, and I won't say their name, came to our elementary school, or I was in middle school then, and gave us a piece of the liner that would be under the landfill, taught us about it, showed us pictures that in 25 years, this would be a beautiful park, told us what to tell our parents when we went home so they wouldn't push back against this. The prison, they had raffles so you could spend the night there. Tours so you could go in and see what it looked like. The promise of all these jobs. The landfill doesn't hire a lot of people. The prison just had the largest prison riot in 40 years. So all these social ills that came from what, the representation thought would bring back tax base. Now let's talk about representation. Lee County is majority African American. At the time that these decisions were made, I don't think there were any African Americans represented on the county council. And so when you lack political capital, when you lack participation in the decision-making process, decisions are made for you. And so this is a challenge that communities are facing and why some people feel helpless in these moments. Now, I didn't know this was environmental justice as a kid. I also attended an amazing HBCU, North Carolina A&T State University, and I took a class in civil rights history and learned about the environmental justice movement, which was launched or birthed just a few miles down the road in Warren County, North Carolina. And it was that picture of black, white, and other people laying on the road trying to stop dump trucks. And I said, wow, people actually have agency. Now, although the landfill's still open in Warren County, but it launched a movement that did the research, that made awareness, or made people aware that these things were happening. So Toxic Waste and Race came out, and I learned it wasn't just my town. You know, other black communities in South Carolina had waste facilities across the country. Most of the landfills were located in places where most of the people look like me. And so it was that moment that I said, as an engineer, also doing civil engineering, that I had to think about what is the intersection of race and income and the lack of political participation that allows people to make decisions for people, to force things on people, to indoctrinate people to accept things that nobody else would want. And so I've dedicated my life to that, the research that I do. I don't want it to just sit in journals, which we know we all love our, to be cited. You know, we want to get our stuff in the top journals, but how do we actually do research that people can use to advocate for themselves and then help people advocate for themselves, right? Because they're not going to know that, you know, you're finding what you're finding unless you tell them. And so it's really about doing work that people can use to advocate for themselves and making sure that they know about the opportunities to do that advocacy work.
Thank you, Tony. Shalanda.
I'm laughing because I love you. And we go way back. So the question is really, you know, what's the light bulb moment? And there are so many inflection points really in my life and my career. I'm a proud queer woman, and I came out in the military during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and I was 21 years old. I was a baby. And at that point in my life, I made the choice that I was going to live for social justice. I was never going to go back in the closet. I was never going to be someone who allowed injustice to kind of proliferate around me, and I was going to work hard to fight against structural inequality and structural injustice. And so I became a lawyer and was a project finance lawyer, which is like, what is that? I mean, it's the type of lawyer that builds energy projects. And I was a corporate lawyer, paying off loans, and just got really disillusioned with legal practice. So I ended up leaving legal practice during the financial crisis, and everyone thought I was nuts. My mom, you know, I'm a first-generation college grad too, and she was like, what are you doing? I mean, like, why? You're leaving a good job. You're not getting fired, right? And so, but I said, Mom, like, the world is on fire. It was the hottest year on record. We had a financial crisis that was, you know, leading to so much unemployment and underemployment in black and brown communities, the gutting, you know, seriously, of the economic gains that have been made in so many places. And I did something crazy. I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico, which is like, also, what? But it was interesting because when I was practicing law and working around the clock, I would step out. I was in Boston, and I would take Spanish classes at night. And, you know, take a Spanish class at 7 o'clock, go back to the office at 9 and like work until whatever. And my Spanish teacher was from Colombia. And she said, there's a lot going on that might be of interest to you in Colombia. And there were people of color, indigenous, Afro-indigenous people in a region called Chocó who were fighting against coal mining. Their water had been polluted. They had been there for generations. And they were fighting against essentially an extractive industry. And so I was taking those Spanish classes and I thought, okay, maybe there's something for me there. And so when I left legal practice in 2009, I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico to learn Spanish, but eventually make my way to Colombia, and eventually work with indigenous people who were fighting against oil and gas and coal mining. But instead, I fell in love with Mexico. And I met indigenous people who were fighting against clean energy. The type of projects that I built as a lawyer, projects that were large scale, wind facilities. And I happened to meet these folks at a park, at a festival where all sorts of folks were talking about, GMOs, other things that were sort of coming in and destroying their communities in Mexico. And some people stood on the stage, they were farmers and fishermen, and they said, our communities are being sold from under us. We are being displaced and dispossessed. We're being threatened by multinational clean energy companies, by multinational wind companies. And it felt like a lightning bolt went down my spine, really, because I thought, oh my gosh, it's not oil and gas, but the same mechanisms of displacement and dispossession are being used in the name of fighting climate change. And it's possible that we might fight the climate crisis, but replicate and exacerbate inequality and injustice. And in that moment, I was like, oh man, I can't unsee this. I ended up on a truck in deep in the woods, or deep in the mountains actually, going to meet communities who were facing this. And I was the only person from outside in this community. And I did what you're never supposed to do in Mexico. I drank the water. Straight from the mountain. And I spent a day hearing from these communities and learning about what was happening. Again, an age-old story that was being told, again, development story in this region. And so I ended up leaving Mexico and becoming a law professor and writing about this issue for 10 years. And it was really unpopular to do so for a long time, to say that we needed to think about equity and justice in our fight to tackle the climate crisis. Because people were so concerned that we were going to lose focus if we started talking about justice too soon. And I said, well, we can't fight the climate crisis if we also don't think about justice. It took another several years before that became a part of the popular discourse, and then I was invited to serve in the Biden administration to lead that work for the country. So there's so many, again, I know as you said, Tony, there's just so many different inflection points that keep me on the path, that say, oh yes, you made the right choice, you made the right choice. But I think for this audience, for students who are wondering what to do and how to stay the course, I think there's something consistent among all of us, which is there's something that lights you up. There's something you can't unsee. And maybe you make a deal with Spirit or with God to take care of you as you stay on your path. And I feel so blessed that I've never compromised my values. I've always been who I am in every single room I'm in. And I know I speak for a lot of people when I'm in those spaces. And so when I'm afraid and my voice shakes a little bit, I think about the millions of people who don't get the chance to sit in those rooms, to say those things, and I can speak for them.
Thank you, Shalanda. Thank you to our panelists for providing real-world examples and context for why you do the work you do. This very conversation could be someone's light bulb moment, so thank you. I'm gonna move on to the next question. It was submitted by one of our amazing audience members, Mason Christerfield. And he wants to know, from your experience, which strategies have been most effective in gaining traction and engaging with underserved communities to see their role in advancing environmental justice, Could you speak to what has actually increased engagement and maybe what hasn't worked so well? And I want to direct this question to Dr. White-Newsome because I'm not picking on you, but I've heard you in the past talk about access and accountability when it comes to underserved communities.
Yes, ma'am. So a couple of things. I think, it's really about relationship building. And when you think about any relationship that you've been in, whether it's a marriage, dating, even between your child. You have to have trust. You have to spend time. You have to be honest with each other. You have to be clear about expectations, what you're going to be able to do, what you're not going to be able to do. You have to invest. And so when I think about what kind of works, because nothing is perfect, is really, I shiver when I hear the word engagement, because to me it is about relationship building. Particularly whether you're government or, again, representing some institution that has probably caused some kind of harm in a particular community, whether it's intentional or unintentional, it is about relationship building. And the one thing that I will say, again, in my 2.5 years in the Biden-Harris administration, we tried to do a better job of relationship building. I was really cognizant about the White House being the people's house. And what that means is that there were folks that came up to me and said, we have never been touched, called, to be a part of any of this or to understand the black box that government can be. And the fact that the administration, again, did not build the environmental justice agenda in an ivory tower, that they actually took the time to go out and talk to folks with wisdom and experience in what needed to happen on the ground to shape the Justice 40 initiative, to shape or figure out we need an environmental justice scorecard. So all that wasn't made up and pulled out the sky. That was grounded in the voices and in the desires and needs of communities. So it's relationship building, I think, is the critical thing. And relationships are gonna have their ups and downs. And you have to be okay with that. And sometimes, again, relationships can be hard. You're hearing things. I'm thinking about so many of the public meetings we had and not being able to give the answer or be able to move as fast, which was the thing that made it really hard for me. I wanted to snap my fingers and say, yes, your community is magically clean. But that could not happen. So that's the power of relationships. And it's relationships that are built to last and not just transactional for the moment.
Thank you, Dr. White-Newsome. Dr. Reames, I know firsthand that you work on the ground to engage underserved communities and energy burden communities. Could you briefly talk about effective engagement strategies?
Yeah, such a great question, particularly in a public institution when we think about our mission and our role to be the people's university. So I did a PhD in public administration. Like I said, my background is civil engineering, but I recognized that there was this connection between policy, particularly policy implementation, and our infrastructure design. And so initially I was interested in green infrastructure, stormwater management. So I tell people the story of doing my very first interview during my PhD, and asking people about rain gardens. There was a lot of money in the Obama administration to help people buy vacant lots near their homes. I was living in Kansas City at the time, and so I was knocking on doors asking people would they buy the vacant lot next door to build a rain garden. How many of you think people wanted to talk to me about rain gardens? This was at the height of the recession. People were losing their homes. And here I am, this little college kid coming around talking about rain gardens. But it was that engagement with elders in Kansas City who actually invited me in and began to talk to me about their energy bills and the unaffordability of their energy bills. And it's one woman that told me when she saw a utility truck, her heart rate would go up. And this was when utility trucks would still roll, or utility companies would still roll a truck to shut people off. Now they can do it remotely because of smart meters. But I asked her to tell me why. And she said, well, baby, even if I've paid my utility bill and they aren't coming to shut me off, say they shut off my neighbor, that still impacts me. And I was like, how? How does it impact you if somebody else is shut off? And she talked about I would have to store their groceries in my refrigerator. I might have to run an extension cord over so they at least have one light in their house at night. Or their kids had to come over and take a bath or do their homework at night. And it was from that those conversations that I recognized the connection or the social side of energy, right? It's not just a technical thing. It's not just an engineering solution. Like, real people are on the other side of those kilowatt hours. And so when I moved here to Michigan in 2014, I had no connections. And I had done my job talk at C's about being able to engage and work in communities. And I was like, who the heck is the community I'm going to talk to? So I spent 2 years reaching out to folks, going to webinars to see who was talking about energy, to learn who that community was. And I had to do that same thing, sit in people's houses, sit in meetings in the evening, to really show that I was serious and that I wasn't just someone trying to extract knowledge from folks, but that I was actually there to share resources that we have here at a place like University of Michigan to make their lives better. And so the last thing I'll say is, when I went after grants, I wanted to make sure that the money I received that would help me with promotion and tenure, that a great portion of it went to the community to support their work. And so before Justice 40, I was trying to make sure that 40+% of a lot of my grants actually were subcontracts to people in the community whose time I was taking to do the work that I felt was important, but also because I knew it took money for them to do their work. And so part of that engagement is recognizing the role that our community partners play in our research, but also compensating them for that participation. So those are two critical components of engagement.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate that all of you in some way talked about, the importance of meeting people where they are and building trust as a part of this work. So thank you. At this point in our session, we're going to engage the audience, and I'd like to turn it over to an amazing C's environmental justice student, Marcella Celine Bowen, to ask our very first audience question.
Hi, I'm Marcella Celine. So one of the questions that I think you all have already answered and spoken on tonight, I wanted to follow up on, as we see the dismantling of environmental justice federally, what can we do to uphold and incentivize continuing that work in our communities and across the nation? It sounds like there's a lot of kinship and relationality that is at the basis of this work. And also, what advice do you have for making progress in the movement, not just sustaining it? And what does that look like in your opinion?
Does anyone want to take this question?
I can jump in.
Okay.
This is the time to organize. I love it. I mean, we should always be organizing, but again, after the grief, because I do think we need to hold space for that. We need to be thinking about the 20-year plan, the 50-year plan. It's so difficult at times in communities that are experiencing environmental justice concerns to think that far ahead. But that is the work. That has to be the work. I mean, January 20th, 2021, folks were planning for last week. They were planning for that. The only way something like that can happen so expeditiously and with such force is through a plan. And so we need to be as organized. And we need to be as unapologetic and unashamed to do the good work. And so organizing is one thing, and I think finding the alliances. I mean, I actually think one reason why the Biden administration was able to come in with the platform that we had was because of the alliances that were made between the environmental justice community and the traditional big green organizations like the Sierra Club, NRDC, and kind of the more resourced organizations. So again, once the grieving is done, and once the grievances are aired, because there are many, there has to be that alliance building. And I think at the local level, people can think about the changes they want to see in their community. I mean, Ann Arbor is one great place. It's a little bit of it's very much a bubble. But an example is, our sustainable energy utility, getting involved with that. The types of projects that sort of paint the vision for where we want to be in 2025, or 2050, oh my God, we are already in 2025, 2050, 2075. we need to be thinking about those projects that leapfrog beyond sort of the chaos that we're going to be in for the next decade, maybe, and create the systems and the types of projects we want for thriving. But there have to be alliances that are built.
And if I may add to that, because it is about working with what we have right now, because I do want everyone to realize we have more activity, more engagement, a larger number of people involved in environmental justice, in decarbonization than we ever have. So we have an opportunity to just continue to push through. And I don't care how you identify, if you use that Google machine, you can find someone who believes what you believe and also believes in environmental justice and decarbonization and clean energy and building resilience. It really is up to every single one of us to use the platforms that are here, to grow the platforms that are here, and to engage. What Shalanda said, none of this stuff just happened overnight. People have been planning this for years. So let's lean into what we know we have to do to keep this movement going. It is to all of our benefit that we address these issues, not one party, not one anything. So, you know, I'm going to go back to our ancestors. I am frustrated, but I don't feel no ways tired. We cannot give up, you all. We really have to be the resistance. We really have to be the resistance. We really have to move the needle in every space that we occupy.
Thank you, Carla.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Dorsey, 2 questions. I only sent in one, but I was asked to stand up and, offer some. I always like to know where I am. I have no qualms of naming names, as some on the stage know. And we are deep in enemy territory. That's where we are, right? We've got a right-wing Republican Regent Hubbard, we should call her name, offering up the antithesis to DI, wants to get rid of it institutionally. We've got relatively anodyne statements in the fall from your colleague, the provost, Provost Baker, really placating, delivering institutional diversity at this campus. So the first question is for the 2 staff of the university. What are maybe 2 or 3 things to do to begin to deliver at the institutional level going forward in the midst of here being properly behind enemy lines with aggressive antithetical statements? Second set is for folks that are not on the campus, as it were, institutionally. My lawyer's reads of the last week's executive orders is that they're a little bit tepid, particularly with respect to renewables. That could certainly change and become much more aggressive. I'm just wondering your thoughts from beyond the university about what we might do positioning to continue to deliver that renewable economy that's really booming. That's where the smart money is. So 2 sets of questions for folks who hear, folks who aren't. Thank you.
No, you want to start? Dr. Dorsey, thank you so much for your engagement, and thank you for the question. So I also want to acknowledge where we are. We're in the first university in the country to have an environmental justice program. We have always been leaders in that space. We set the standard nationally. We have the richest faculty, I would say, in teaching and thinking and writing about environmental justice, climate justice, energy justice. I mean, we have the nation's leader in energy justice right here. So we are not going back. We're not going back. And my view, as the first ever Vice Provost for Sustainability and Climate Action, is that we need to consolidate those assets and make them a resource not only for the students who move through this university, but for the region, the state, and the nation. And it is my intention to stand behind our history. That's my intention. I also want to acknowledge that every single student who comes to the University of Michigan comes from a place that has been impacted by climate change. Full stop. Whether you're from California, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, even Michigan, every single place in this country has been impacted. And so students come into this place understanding that the world that they come from has been changed. And they have a rightful expectation that they should be taught about that world and taught how to operate in it. An unequal world where Black and brown people, low-income people, people from rural communities continue to be harmed by the energy system is not one in which our students will be able to thrive. So we also have an obligation to teach them about justice and teach them how to be stewards of the immense privilege that they will exit this university with, right? So my job as a vice provost for sustainability and climate is to make sure, first of all, they understand how to operate in a climate change world, and that we are educating them not only in the classroom, but in all of their experiences about that world, and giving them the tools they need to operate, but also educating them about how to be citizens in a world where inequality and injustice will be absolutely exacerbated by the climate crisis, and their role to undo that, their role to right that. It doesn't matter what their majors are, if they're nurses, pharmacists. I see a kinesiologist in the room. It does not matter what they're studying. They will have obligations and responsibilities, and I think they're expecting us to prepare them for that. So I stand behind what I said. I said what I said.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Always good to see you and to hear your thoughts in this space. An interesting connection that we have. When I was a PhD student, I had to invite someone in the energy and climate space to come speak at University of Kansas. And I found out about this guy and invited him to spend some time with us in Lawrence, Kansas. And from that point, an amazing relationship has blossomed. So I'm always excited to see him. I talked about being at a public university earlier, and to me that's very critical and inherent to who I am. I'm public school educated, attended all public universities for my own higher education, and so I understand the role of places like the University of Michigan. And I think the students that are here and the faculty and staff are also here because of the role of public institutions in both educating our populace, but also taking that knowledge and allowing it to have impact in the world. And so I know the people that are paying tuition to come here expect me to teach them the ways of this world in a way that they can leave here and have impact. And so when I talk to my students, we talk that way. And when I came back and I was talking to Dean Overpeck at SEAS, that's what I told him. I said, I want to come back and I want to do something that is going to have impact. And a few years ago, School for Environment and Sustainability launched the Detroit Sustainability Clinic. We're not a land grant, so we don't have extensions. But in conversations, many of the faculty who were doing work with community organizations realized that some of us were working with the same organization on multiple projects, but that we needed a way to provide a conduit for university to connect with community and community to connect with university, but also to take what we're learning from our individual projects to make sure the greater community doesn't have to start from scratch. And so the mechanism of the clinic allows us to connect our students with real-world projects in the Detroit community, allows Detroit community organizations to reach out and say, hey, I have a question, I have a project. Let me get some smart minds to help. And you build that project together, and then that project can help the next community group figure out how to do something similar or take it to the next level. And so it's really the information that is built here, the education that is created here, the knowledge that communities have, really bringing that together to continue the work, right? You know, and we can stress about the funding for it, but then that's when we all work together to find additional funding for those projects. The projects that are happening now that will hopefully keep their funding, what do we learn from those projects? How do we as a university actually do the research to support organizations in sharing their story? So again, everybody's not starting from scratch, and we're planning now when we have another opportunity for resources that we can keep it going. And so it's really about working with communities and building the, you know, kind of reservoir of what's possible.
And regarding, if I may,
Yep, I was gonna
answer
say, in the
Dr.
interest of
Dorsey's
time.
question. It's good to see you, Dr. Dorsey. I want to acknowledge you. I want to acknowledge Regina Strong from the state and Miss Elmore, and so many people who are in this fight no matter what. So many of us were in this fight. Yeah, I mean, we just are. We are here. And administrations come and go, and they leave legacies. But we are not going to be moved. We're going to do what we know to do, period. I love talking about renewable energy because it's so sexy. But I don't want to leave. There is nothing more sexy than renewable energy. Everybody wants it. We all need it, blah, blah, blah. It's absolutely true. But before I go to renewable energy, I want to talk about plain old energy efficiency. Before you all broach any renewable energy projects, please weatherize, please insulate, please do the things that are going to allow you to invest less in whatever that renewable energy solution is, okay? So don't skip the boring stuff, because it really is going to save you money. And everyone deserves a right to renewable energy because it is cleaner. It is becoming less expensive. It is becoming a much bigger industry than the fossil industry was, and we can live with it. I see, is that Liesl Clark? And the only reason I mention Liesl is she loves for me to mention that in the My Healthy Climate Plan that the state wrote under her direction, the word equity is in that plan 17 times. So while we shake, and what that does is it gives the people at the state the right to budget for equity and develop plans for equity on the front end instead of shoehorning it in or even deciding whether it's important. This state has decided equity is important, and that includes our right to the benefits of clean energy and renewable energy, the wealth that's created in this energy transition. One of the things that I love about renewable energy is that we haven't figured so many things out. There's an opportunity for everyone to innovate. There's an opportunity for, you know, my friends are, I have a girlfriend who owns an EV charging station manufacturing facility, right? And I'm like, girl, in another year, we're gonna be charging, you know, driving down the road charging. So, you know, I want some friends to be figuring that out, right? We have the technology, now we have to decrease the cost of it. I want people to be in policy, not just renewable energy, but renewable energy policy, right? Because if you're not writing policy, what are you doing? You are responding to bad policy, and you are trying to change policy. I want to make sure that we are not letting the renewable energy transition, the clean energy transition happen to us, but that we are influencing it. So don't be afraid. It is not magic, and we all have a place. We need it. We'll live longer, healthier, happier, and the number of jobs and businesses that this transition is creating right now, even as we speak, is incomparable to any economic transition in this country up until now. So find your place in the clean energy transition.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Carla.
And my daughter, we didn't mention that Madeline is my daughter, and you all know what the side eye is? I just got the side eye. Not to talk so long.
Thank you, Carla.
And thank you so much to our amazing audience for asking such interesting and relevant questions. In the interest of time, I would like for us to transition. You know, our session is closing, and I want each of you to give us your call to action to advance environmental justice. What do you want to leave the audience with? What's really important to you at this time? And we'll start with Dr. White-Newsome.
What a surprise.
Oh, boy. So first of all, just so appreciate this conversation. And what I'll leave you with very briefly is accountability. You know, we have a federal government that might not share the same values that we all care about in this room. I'm making that assumption. But it doesn't mean that we let them off the hook. There are still processes, there's still a federal register, there's still a way for us to make our voice and our grunts heard. So I encourage you not to forget the federal government because they still have a responsibility to us. So that's point one. The second thing is that, again, EJ is local. So when you talk about the responsibility that each of us have in here, whether you're a mom, a grandparent, a student, what is it that you're going to do? What are you going to take on when you talk about local action? Is it you're going to start attending, you know, city council meetings? You're going to look at tools that describe what's going on in your community and figure out, well, this is something that I could begin to co-create a policy for. Like, what is that action that you're going to take? Because you have local government, you have state government. We have to hold those folks accountable as well. So I guess my big thing is accountability, but also not letting folks backslide, right? So I think about the examples. Again, the federal government did some great stuff. We had some states and cities that took on the spirit of our Justice 40 initiative and made some local executive orders and state executive orders. We can still do that. We can bring the spirit of the past administration into our state, local, city. So how we do that is what I want to challenge you. What is going to be your role in keeping the spirit of justice and equity going? Because it does not end with the president's pen. So that's my challenge to you.
Amen.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. White-Newsome.
And so we all have our tendencies to operate, and sometimes we're operating out of hope, sometimes we're operating out of fear. And for me, this is a scary time, I'm not gonna lie. But I have so much hope. And Dr. Reames quotes Martin Luther King. I like to quote myself. And my favorite quote by me, and I try to always say it, is I am a hypersensitive introvert, highly anxious person, you all. And so many things scare me, and I'm in renewable energy. So my quote by me is, courage is a renewable resource. And the reason I say that is we all have times where it's just too much, it's just too hard, and we don't do the courageous thing. But for me, there is nothing worse than being in that room and not doing the courageous thing and then having to deal with myself later, because I could have made a difference. I'm asking, my call to action is that when you are in a room, when you can make a difference, be courageous and do that. That's how we win.
Thank you.
So this is not the first time that Carla has said that. And it's usually right before I end up quoting somebody else. So one day I will have my own quote. But I do, of course, and some people may know I do have a favorite quote that is not by me, but is by George Washington Carver. And the quote is, "When you can do the common thing in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world." And I think that is what this moment requires of us. We've been here before, right? Our ancestors have been here before. And so there are nuggets of information and tools and tactics that people have used in moments like this, or in other moments that can be applied to this moment, right? You may be an engineer. How do you take your engineering skills and apply it to this moment that we're in? You may be in some other field that might have some skills, tools, and tactics that can be used in another part of our society. And so whether you join groups like my students asked today, like who's saving the data? Websites are disappearing from the federal infrastructure every minute. And so groups like EDGI, the Environmental Data Governance Institute, whether you join some of the groups that have always been in this fight, become members of nonprofits and community-based organizations that are fighting daily, whether we had a Democrat in office or a Republican, to support their efforts. And so the tools, tactics, and skills that you have that already exist, so reading history, going to like the Charles H. Wright African American History Museum and learning about the movements of the civil rights era, we've been here before. And so you don't have to feel helpless, like you can't do anything. Again, there are resources out there that allow you to pick up what others have done, stand on their shoulders, and continue in the fight. And so that's my call of action, thinking about the common things that you do and that you know, and apply it in an uncommon way.
Thank you, Tony. Shalanda.
Thank you. What an amazing panel. I love being on this panel, and yes, so great. So my call to action is to dream. To dream. So we live in a country that has never perfected itself. And for many communities that are on the front lines of climate change, the front lines of environmental justice, they're constantly in fight mode. They're constantly in fight mode. There's not enough space to dream about the world they would create if they had a blank slate. I want to be in that space. I'm tired of fighting. I'm ready to dream. And I see the dreamers out there. I see people who are creating food co-ops, who are rethinking the food system, rethinking the energy system at a local level. I see folks who are thinking about what types of water systems they want, right? Like, how are we gonna do this? And again, I keep referencing 2050, 2100. We have to be thinking about that world. We are going to be in a climate change world. Doesn't mean we stop fighting that. But we also have to think about the systems that will produce equity and justice. Because we don't want to back into that. We don't want to have to sort of, oh God, we're here. How did we get here? Now what? So now is the time to dream. Now is the time to dream, and that's a much more enriching place than a place of always sort of being fighting, in the fight mode. So I'm leaning into that in the next year and the years to come.
Thank you, Shalanda. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists. You guys are wonderful energy and environmental justice experts, and I think I speak for the audience when I say that we're truly grateful for your presence. And I hope to see all of you at future environmental justice conversations. I hope you guys will converse amongst yourselves as it relates to these topics. We appreciate you coming, and we wish you a wonderful night.